Okay. Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Rebecca Gruneau.
Hi, and tonight we have Abayomi Azikiwe. He is the editor of the Pan-African Newswire. It is an electronic press agency founded in 1998. He has worked for decades in solidarity with liberation movements and progressive governments on the African continent and in the Caribbean. And I know he has a wealth of information. And so we asked him here to tell us about it tonight. Welcome, Abayomi.
Well, thank you once again for the invitation.
Yeah, we always need to come to you because there's always news from Africa, and we don't know who else to trust, really. We actually we wanted you to come here because we were hearing stuff about conflict in the Congo and the Sudan, but if you want to talk about other things, that's fine too, because we've also seen news about big things going on in Nigeria, things going on in Kenya. There's a lot of activity on the continent right now, and not a lot of attention being paid to it. So wherever you want to start.
Well, thanks once again for the invitation. I think one thing is very interesting about the situation in Sudan is that the Sudanese Armed Forces General, Al-Fatah al-Burhan, has been invited to China next week to participate in the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. They're having their summit in China next week, and he is invited to participate, and he appears to be going there next week to participate. And there'll be many other African heads of state that will be visiting Beijing as well. FOCAC has its origin some 24 years ago. They have had several summits since 2000, and they emphasize cooperation between African Union member states and the People's Republic of China, where there's an enormous amount of trade, as well as other forms of cooperation between the African Union region and the PRC. So that should be a very interesting conference to follow, starting on September the 2nd. It'll be going through September the 6th. Now, this comes at a time when the Republic of Sudan has been embroiled over the last 16 months in a inner military conflict. I don't think we could call it a civil war. It largely involves personnel from the Sudanese Armed Forces headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and of course the commander of the Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary group, Mohamed Delgado, also known as Samete. And they have been battling for the last a year, almost a year and a half. And what's really interesting about all of this is that it is the masses of the Sudanese people who have been striving for democratic transition and social transformation who are the victims, who are highly victimized by this conflict that's been going on since April 15th of 2023. What has happened is that there's been a lot of displacement of several million people. Some people have fled the country into neighboring Chad, neighboring Republic of South Sudan, as well as into Egypt. So this is putting a strain on the other contiguous states, and the humanitarian impact is quite disastrous. And the problem is that neither party really genuinely wants to sit down and hammer out their differences. The SAF, they have stated publicly, that is the Sudanese Armed Forces, they want an outright military victory over the RSF. So that's going to be a very difficult starting point when you talk about peace talks and negotiations, all of which have failed over the last year and a half, nearly a year and a half. So Sudan is going to be very, very interesting to look at in light of the FOCAC summit that's going to be taking place next week.
I've
Is
been.
it basically kind of a thing between two strongmen, or is there more than that?
Yeah, essentially that's what it is. Because, as you remember, in December of 2018, we're approaching 6 years. Uh, the masses in Sudan began to demonstrate and strike and boycott because of the rising cost of living in that country. Even though it's an oil-rich state, even though it was an emerging oil-rich state up until the time of the partition in back in 2011. But at the same time, you have these internal conflicts that are going on, and the military, for various reasons, did not want to relinquish control even to a transitional civilian government. In April of 2019, the former president and military leader, and he was Omar Hassan al-Bashir, was overthrown by his military colleagues. And they thought that that would stop the demonstrations and the calls for democracy inside the country, because you had broad-based coalitions that had formed. And at that point, the masses were ready for a new political dispensation. Now, the president who was overthrown in 2019, al-Bashir, was wanted by various international bodies, but he has not been turned over. And he still remains, as far as I know, in detention in Sudan. Now, 2 months after that, people continue to demonstrate and sit in out in front of the Ministry of Defense in Khartoum. And the military and the RSF decided that they had to move. And of course, there was a huge massacre in June of 2019, where it's estimated several hundred people were killed. And after that, there was a real threat of further social deterioration. So the African Union got involved, and they were able to negotiate an agreement to establish a transitional government, to set up a transitional military council, which had been set up in April of 2019, and also to set up a sovereign council. Now, this sovereign council has undergone several transformations since 2019. To say only that the democratic thrust of the movement that arose during the early months of 2019 has been suppressed because of the fighting between the two different military factions. So what's important is to bring this war to an end, which has proven to be a very, very difficult task. And at the same time, to keep in mind that there has to be some type of democratic transformation in the Republic of Sudan. There's a tremendous amount of potential there to impact not only that country, but other countries throughout the region. So it's been very difficult to try to bring these two parties together for substantive and serious negotiations aimed at ending the war.
Yeah, I think since we first started talking about the Sudan, the main thrust has been just that the war needs to end. It's not like there's a particular good guy and a particular bad guy. It's just, the people are sort of on the sidelines and they're getting hurt in the middle of this huge conflict, and it just needs to stop. I was wondering, though, because, I've been seeing there was a kind of a mini surge maybe a month or two ago of reports. The BBC had a report on the Sudan. The Amnesty International had a report on the Sudan. There was a bunch of things that all sort of came out, and they were all extremely harsh regarding the RSF, which I don't think is, in any way is wrong. I think there's a lot to be harsh about there. I don't distrust them at all when they say there were all sorts of atrocities and people forced to flee. But it was interesting that it was so one-sided in that they really kind of gave the government a complete pass and just focused on how evil the RSF is. And so it seemed like there was definitely some taking of sides there. I don't know if that's an appropriate taking of sides, or that represents Western interests, or exactly why that's happening. Maybe it's deserved. I don't know. Can you give us your evaluation?
Well, according to the reports that have come out over the last several months, the RSF has engaged in attacking civilian neighborhoods, attacking healthcare facilities, and also attacks on groups within North Darfur, which has caused a lot of displacement. At the same time, the SAF has refused to hold any talks with the RSF being the paramilitary group, and they won an outright military victory. So that is a major discussion right now in terms of any type of Sudanese conflict resolution. There were supposed to have been discussions just 2 weeks ago in Geneva, Switzerland. And because of the way in which it was structured, the Sudanese armed forces under al-Burhan, who is ostensibly the chair of the Sovereign Council at this point, he said that the United States, who was setting up these discussions, did not recognize his status in Sudan. He said that no high-ranking U.S. Diplomatic official has visited Sudan since April of 2023. So al-Burhan said he was not attending and his supporters were not attending, but the RSF was there. And then at some point they said they were not going to participate either. So the discussions that were held by other forces, including the United States, the United Nations, and also some groups from the Gulf Arab states. Now, you've had stories that have been circulating for well over a year that Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, was supporting the military, the Sudanese armed forces, and that the United Arab Emirates were supporting the Rapid Support Forces. And this argument was even brought before the United Nations several months ago when the Sudanese government, meaning, of course, the Sudanese armed forces that are representing the government at the United Nations, accused the United Arab Emirates of funding the RSF. So these are some of the dynamics that are taking place that's also hindering the capacity of either side to engage in peace talks. Now we have the former interim prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok, who only served for a very brief period of time. He was overthrown by elements within the military. And after that, he was reinstated. After he was overthrown, he was reinstated several months later. And then, of course, he resigned once again. Now, he has started, Abdallah Hamdok has started his own peace initiative where he has engaged in dialogue with the RSF. This, of course, has drawn the criticism of the Sudanese armed forces headed by al-Burhan. So they were supposed to have discussions in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, several weeks ago, which did not bear fruit at all. So these are some of the variables that are involved that are hindering the capacity of international forces as well as domestic forces to bring about peace talks. Whether or not the Sudanese armed forces can militarily defeat the RSF remains to be seen. There's reports that the Sudanese armed forces have made gains against the RSF, driving them out of areas in which they controlled in Omdurman, which is the twin capital city of the Republic of Sudan. So that's pretty much where the situation is right now. But I thought it was very interesting that both Russia has sent in high-level diplomats to have discussions with Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and also now the Chinese government has invited him to participate in the FOCAC conference that will be starting this coming week.
It seems that, I mean, in a way that's very logical to me, just because China and Russia have some of the best diplomats in the world, and the United States these days doesn't seem to really understand or do diplomacy well, right? They just don't seem to kind of get it. They can have as many conferences as they want with none of the major parties present, But I mean, the whole heart of diplomacy is talking to the parties involved, and they seem to never be able to like really do that. They don't seem to. They're always pressing for some particular solution that the U.S. Wants, and it's. I mean, I think one of the things I think that's kind of what I think is kind of going on in the West here is I think you could just look at the situation and just be very cynical about it and think, where is the solution? There is no solution, right? It's these you have kind of this long term sort of seems like endless sort of cyclical wars in the area. Something seems like it's resolved, like it's going somewhere, it falls back, everything erupts into chaos again. And you don't really have a good guy. I mean, we really like to see that there's a good guy and a bad guy so we can defeat the bad guy. And it's like, there's no like obvious kind of very simplistic formula that just gets this all to being right again. And we were looking for some sort of simplistic formula, and there just isn't one there.
No, there isn't. But at the same time, the people who are pushing for a democratic Sudan are the people who need to be consulted, and they need to take charge of the entire process. Now, that's almost impossible at this point because they're not armed. And the people who are armed, heavily armed, are preventing any real democratic discussion and debate inside the country. And it was quite interesting that neither side, in my opinion, whether it's the RSF or the Sudanese armed forces, really wanted a genuine democratic government in the Republic of Sudan. They were doing everything in their power to prevent this transition, which initially was supposed to take 39 months. They didn't want that to happen. So even under Abdallah Hamdok, who was very pro-Western, very oriented towards international finance capital, he went as far, which was illegal, to recognize the state of Israel, which the Sudanese Israel Boycott Act passed in 1958 outlaws. He did this thinking that it would help the country to acquire loans through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other global financial institutions. Well, of course, this didn't happen, and the situation has only gotten worse since that particular time period. So it's a tragedy because Sudan is, as I mentioned before, has a tremendous amount of resources. They're located, they have a port, Port Sudan in the east, on the Red Sea, and they have historically had extensive trade with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other countries in the region. So, but it has been used as a pawn in the international power struggles, even during the period of the previous government of Omar Hassan al-Bashir. They switched sides in terms of an alliance with Iran and to an alliance with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which did not help the country at all economically. And then these two countries stepped in after the military coup of April 2019 to offer several $billions to shore up the government, the military government at the time in Sudan. But this did not prevent this falling out between the two major military factions inside the country. So to the extent that the UAE is supporting the RSF and the Saudi government is supporting the Sudanese armed forces, it has not helped at all to resolve the internal problems inside the country.
I mean, so they've put a lot of money into their particular factions,
yes,
but it isn't really helping people. I
mean,
mean,
not at all. The people are suffering.
I understand the people are still suffering. I mean, there is, at least you see occasionally some things about there being famine there.
Yes, it is. And that's because of the displacement, the inability of the agricultural sector to produce food. Also, you have a problem with the overall society, the government, infrastructure and institutions have been severely hampered. The healthcare facilities in the country are being attacked and dislocated by the various military factions that are engaging in conflict inside the country. So, as bad as the situation was, even under the previous government of al-Burhan, the al-Burhan government, the al-Bashir government, it's worse now because of the inter-military conflict that's going on inside the country. Now, you mentioned U.S. diplomacy, and a lot of the instability is a direct result of U.S. diplomacy in Sudan. And we see this replicated in other parts of Africa as well. If we look at the Sahel region, for example, with the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the U.S. totally mishandled the situation that arose after the overthrow of Mohamed Bazoum last July in Niger. They threatened the government. They wanted to hire the Economic Community of West African States to stage a U.S. and French-backed military intervention to restore Mohamed Bazoum to power and to overthrow the CNSP government. And the opposition to this throughout the region was so vast that they had to back off of it. And even the president of Nigeria, who had just gotten into office, Bola Tinubu, even his own political party would not go along with the plans to stage a military intervention in Niger.
Yeah,
and then they broke with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, formed their own Alliance of Sahel States. And over the last several months, the president of Nigeria and the Economic Community of West African States have literally been begging these three Sahel states to rejoin ECOWAS, and they have refused to do so. So it's a lot of dynamics that are involved in that. The whole renewed Cold War between the Russian Federation, the United States, and NATO, because Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have now invited in Russian military advisors. And that, of course, has really angered.
After kicking out France and the United States and breaking off relations with Ukraine and all these other things.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. The situation involving Ukraine. Now, many of us have been saying for years that the rebels that are fighting in the Sahel region and even in other parts of Africa are backed by the United States intelligence forces. We saw this in Libya. We've seen it in other countries. So now, with the Malian government saying that Ukraine is training rebel forces to fight against the government, and as a result of that, they've broken relations with Ukraine and also with Sweden as well. It's really an interesting situation. It's confirming what has been said and accused for many years.
Yeah, that seems to fit. I mean, and it also is very strange because if Ukraine has had so much problems finding men to fight in their own war, their own proxy war, then what are they doing in Africa?
Yes, obviously they're being sent there by the government in Washington, D.C., and perhaps the one in France as well, Paris, France. That's the only thing I can think of, because they have been having a lot of problems trying to recruit and retain soldiers. This has been going on for well over a year. And now they've been staging an incursion into the Kursk area of Russia. And they made it look like it was a major military advance, but it's turning out to be a disaster for the Ukrainians and consequently for the NATO forces as well. So, yes, it's a very complicated situation, but the diplomacy, as you mentioned earlier, that the United States has been involved in has been an unmitigated disaster. I mean, look at what they've done in Ukraine. During the early phase of the special military operation, there were efforts, at least two efforts, in Belarus as well as in Turkey, to negotiate a ceasefire and to end the war. And the United States threatened Ukraine that they should not negotiate.
Well, I mean,
settlement with Russia.
the agreement, the first set of round of agreements in Belarus was before the war. It was the breakdown of those agreements that led to the war.
Yeah.
Because the agreements were negotiated in bad faith. Since then the
Minsk agreements.
The parties on the Ukrainian side have said that they never intended those to be seriously followed. They were just an excuse to make time to build up their war machine. And and then you had the Istanbul Accords, which were all initialed and kind of ready to go, and you had Boris Johnson and the U.S. Stepping in to say you can't sign those, and we'll back you to the end. And of course, now they're not backing them to the end, right? So that's they were the Ukrainians were sort of led along the primrose path, and they're about to be abandoned. And you can sort of see that because there's all these reports coming out about all the Nazi paraphernalia on the Ukrainian soldiers are wearing in the Kursk offensive. And it's like, people who've been critical of the war have been, pointing out these Nazi things since the very beginning, and now it's sort of coming into the mainstream because you kind of feel like they're looking for an excuse to ditch Ukraine. They don't want to spend the money on Ukraine anymore.
Yes,
they've got the money. They have to spend money on Israel now, and they still are planning their big war on China, so they have to spend money on Taiwan. And
they want to move on to their next war.
And it's really there's a big contrast there because in those places, those are the places that you get all the news about, and the government makes all sorts of big speeches about how the other side is so evil and they're doing all these terrible things. We need to stop them. And here's $50 billion here, and here's $20 billion there. And when it comes to Africa, it's like, no, we're just going to play Africa on the down low. We'll send the CIA over there. We'll have some like special forces that like no one will even kind of know about. There'll be, some guy from the U.S. Special Forces will get killed in Niger, and like everyone in the media will say, "Wait, we're in Niger? Why are we? I didn't know we were in Niger. Why are we in Niger?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, we've been there. We've been fighting terrorists, yeah." And but you're I think when you talk about the CIA being there and training rebel forces, I think this is a pattern that we've seen sort of accused over and over again, that the U.S. Says they're going into a place so they can fight ISIS, so they can fight Al Qaeda, so they can fight all these like terrorist groups, right? I need to fight Boko Haram, right? And then you sort of see we go into those places and we don't really fight those people. We kind of just, it seems like we sort of prop them up and put them there so we could have an excuse to intervene. And, we don't really go after them. Oh, wait a second. I'm sorry. This is the half point music. I didn't expect that to come up. Hold on a second. I'm just going to turn this down. Yeah.
Usually happens is, we have to look at what is the real reason that we're there, and it's usually some
some big
oil, it's some some resource.
We've got some geopolitical game. We're trying to attack some rival. We want to break them up and reduce the competition and be able to take the resources for ourselves, right? It's kind of and yeah, it's the whole imperialist game which we see over and over again. But Africa has sort of played a different way. There was also that report I mentioned several months ago where some U.S. guy was arrested in the Congo and they accused him of being CIA, and he probably was CIA. This is another one of these patterns that just occurs, and all these things happen, and there's like almost no media attention to them, right? They play them in a totally different way. The U.S. role in these places is much more kind of secretive, much more kind of like underhanded and subtle. But we're still there. We're still trying to stir things up and pick our side, and regime change different governments and pressure people in different directions.
Yes, and Niger, the diplomacy of the United States was a complete failure. They went there and threatened the government, telling them if you don't reinstall our puppet, then we're going to overthrow your government, and it didn't work. it didn't work at all, because not only the people in Niger supported the CNSP government, people in other states around the region, in Nigeria and Ghana, all spoke out against this proposed military intervention into Niger. And then, of course, they turned around and told the French they had to leave, and then the United States was told they had to leave. And this blows the cover. You mentioned the muzzling of news reports in regard to developments in Africa, but this really exposed it, because the fact that the U.S. had to start packing up its bags and getting out, and they have a drone station there that they're going to have to dismantle. So it's going to be a really a major blow for the United States in regard to their geostrategic interests on the African continent. But they're still operating in other areas, as we mentioned, the Sahel, the attacks on Malian soldiers and Russian military personnel that are there at the invitation of the Malian government that resulted in the deaths of soldiers as well as military advisors. And of course, with the linking of this to Ukraine, shows that this is a new Cold War that we're facing right now. And it's a worldwide situation, because they see Africa as a strategic battleground in terms of Western imperialist influence. And they have to seek to continue to dominate the continent of Africa, as well as other geostrategic regions throughout the world. The diplomacy in Palestine has failed just absolutely miserably. Antony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State, has been to the West Asia, Middle East, North Africa region at least a dozen times over the last 10 months. And the fighting is still going on in Gaza. People are still being massacred every day. And it's just not working out for the United States diplomatically.
I don't think that. I think the U.S. was pressing for a solution of ethnic cleansing without genocide. The U.S. plan was to get other countries to accept Palestinian refugees and to open up the doors to try to empty out the region of Palestinians and let Israel take it all. Right, and everyone sort of saw through that and said, "No, we're not going to support the ethnic cleansing of Palestine." Well, and we don't want all those people in our country anyway. So, no, we can do what's in our own economic interests and claim to be on the high moral ground at the same time. So, what are you offering us? Nothing.
Nothing. And you see all the Palestinians who have been scattered outside of Palestine, at least since 1947, 1948. Are still not able to return to their homeland. So this is a major issue, and it's been covered up by both the Republican and the Democratic parties. We saw last week in Chicago what happened at the DNC, where they did not want to have any Palestinian Americans speak from the stage. There was a workshop on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The findings never reached the main stage. I can recall perhaps 2-3 people mention what was going on in Gaza, but they did not dwell on it at all. Mm-hmm. So this could really be a major impediment to the Democratic Party ticket for November.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's many people in the party that we know that have sort of landed on both sides of this, right? There are people that are, they have that 4-year crazy that they just have to support the Democrats no matter what. And then you've got the other people that are just so profoundly upset at the way they were ignored and, mistreated and laughed at. And, the Democratic Party spitting in the face of many members of its own base. And they're just sort of done with it.
When they're coming out of the convention center with their fingers in their ears as the Palestinians are reading off lists of those children who have died. Yes. I mean, that's just, that seems so, I can't even find words.
Yes. And we look at the horrendous conditions that exist. And the fact that the Republic of South Africa had filed suit back in December against the State of Israel, charging violations of the Genocide Convention, and the United States gave absolutely no support to that legal effort. In fact, they said it had no merit. This is what Kirby said, who's the National Security Advisor for the Biden White House. And this is why hundreds of thousands of people voted uncommitted during the Democratic primaries.
I want to get a news alert if that guy ever says anything that's actually true.
I don't know.
I mean, that is just like, he's in competition for the worst person in the world.
Yeah.
Him and his counterpart Miller, those guys giving the press conferences are just so full of it, just egregious. But I think what we've seen, we've seen Africa getting stronger. We've seen Africa asserting itself on the world stage. You've had things like the action in the International Court of Justice. You've seen things like the missions to try to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. You've seen, this very strong commitment that they've had to Palestine, and at the same time, you've had the United States. I think the collapse of their ability to conduct diplomacy is based mainly on just hubris, that they're constantly overplaying their hand. They're not dealing with the world as it is today. They're dealing with the world as they're used to it being. And they're thinking that if they can make a few threats, everyone will fall into line. But the problem with that is that there's too many people that they're threatening, and they can all stand together now. And everyone kind of sees that, it's like, if you stand against the United States, you're not standing alone. You're standing with dozens of other countries that also don't like being pushed around. And everyone's sort of starting to stand up now and calling the bluff. And the U.S. can't really do anything because it's already overtaxed in Ukraine and Israel, and it's trying to make its war with China, and it doesn't have a lot left to like pummel your little country. So what does it do, right? It's sort of less and less feared, right? It can still mess up countries, but it can't really get what it wants. It was kicked out of Afghanistan, right? When have we actually won a war with anybody? It's like, they're just, yes, you look at some place like Cuba right now or Venezuela. Those places are suffering because of U.S. sanctions, right? The U.S. sanctions can have a deep effect on these countries, but I think. Sanctioned countries can sometimes do very well under U.S. sanctions because if they hold together and support one another, there's a way to get through it. And we've seen some very successful, like, hey, we're thriving under sanctions, says Russia, right?
Well, last week as well, there was the Southern African Development Community 44th annual summit that took place in Zimbabwe. And that's another example of a country where sanctions and destabilization programs have been thrown at them now for approximately 25 years, yet they've been able to survive. And the participants in the SADC conference had nothing but praise for Zimbabwe for organizing this summit under extreme pressure from the United States, Britain, and the European Union. Of course, these sanctions, there appears to be no end of the lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe under the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, ZANU-PF government. They want to make sure that they strangle them to the extent that they can. And we've seen similar situations taking place, for example, in Cuba or in Venezuela, where recently in Venezuela there was another attempted coup attempt, making it appear as if the elections that were held were illegitimate. Just a few days ago, the Supreme Court there said that Nicolas Maduro did win the elections, and they've been able to influence several countries in the South America and Central America region as well. But this is nothing new in regard to Venezuela or Zimbabwe. This goes back over 2 decades. There was an attempt in 2002 to overthrow the former president Hugo Chavez. He was kidnapped, but fortunately, they were able to reinstate him as the
Well, the
leader of
people
the
stood
country.
up. The people
Exactly.
stood up for him, and some of the military. But I mean, they would not have had that clout if it had not been for the people.
No, absolutely not. So there's constant interference throughout South America, the Caribbean, the African continent, the Asia Pacific region, Eastern Europe, South Asia. We saw a recent color revolution in Bangladesh, which
Yes.
the ousted prime minister said that was engineered by the United States because they would not allow them to take control of an island in the Bay of Bengal, St. Martin's. This is what Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina said after her removal from office several weeks ago. So they're everywhere attempting to destabilize various geopolitical regions in the world. And this is very costly to the working people and poor people and oppressed people in the United States and these other Western European and UK imperialist countries. If you look at the conditions that people are living under in England right now, a lot of people are extremely poor. And even the new Labour government that came out earlier today saying that there was a 22 billion pound hole in the national budget that they say they were not aware of. So it's going to take drastic action to bring these countries to a point where the majority of the people, the majority of the working people, young people, farmers are able to have some breathing room and to improve their overall condition within society.
I mean, at the risk of continuing to broaden the discussion, you see the Democratic Party restoring support for the death penalty to their platform. You see this weird kind of coup in France where Macron just refuses to allow a new government to sit after having called the elections that resulted in a new people being elected. He won't let them form a government. He's just going to stay there, apparently, because he doesn't like the people that got elected. So you have
and they were left wing.
yeah. So you have this, and then they're trying to do this kind of like, oh, they're anti-Semites kind of thing, trying to this weird kind of, again, this is becoming a tool of imperialism everywhere now, and it's a tool of like domestic authoritarianism.
Yes.
They're shutting down your access to TikTok. They're turning your Facebook information over to the government, and it's like we're just sort of seeing this kind of general degradation of democracy and this sort of preparation for social unrest. You see, there's a reason why Cop City is coming up now, right? There's a reason why all this stuff is being built up, because things are bad and they're going to get worse, and the people are going to be unhappy, and they don't want to give the people what they want. They're not going to be able to give the people what they want. So they're just going to use force, right? So this is what they're preparing. And it's like,
yes, in France, it was interesting. Before the Olympics, President Macron said, "Well, we need to deal with the Olympics right now. We'll allow for the appointment of another government after the Olympics." And the Olympics have been over now for 2 weeks, and it's still, I have not heard about any new prime minister.
So what's the excuse now?
Well, I mean, it was Macron that called the snap elections,
Exactly.
all right at that particular time. It's like, we're going to have elections. The people are going to come in, and they're going to come in, and the Olympics are going to be happening, right? And it's like, and then, well, you're the one who arranged it so they'd be coming in at that time, but now you want to delay, right? And then, of course, the excuse for the delay disappears, and he still wants to delay. And he sets these conditions. Well, if you agree not to have this person, then we can talk. It's like, well, what happens if we agree? You're still not going to do it, right? No, of course we're still not going to do it, but we can pretend like we're talking. The whole thing. The whole thing is just. It's you see. I mean, it's really. I know that a lot of countries that are sort of on the other side of this divide, right? The kind of, the axis of resistance, the BRICS countries, all the people that are sort of outside of this Europe plus 6 countries that we consider to be like the international community, right? U.S., Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and most of Europe, right? That is the international community according to the U.S. Everything else doesn't count. But all these other places that actually are there, that do exist, that form the global South, that include all the BRICS countries, you know, they're not always great, you know, in terms of the governments. They're not always, you know, the types of governments that we'd want to see. But, you know, overall, I don't think you can say that they're especially authoritarian compared to what we're having in the West now, because what we're seeing in the West is just becoming less and less obviously democratic, right? You're seeing all of the kind of ways in which, you know, the democracy is sort of for show, and that really, when it comes down to it, the people that you've been electing all this time are just going to rule whether or not you like it. Um, it's just really disturbing to see kind of that facade crumbling, the kind of revealing of the West really isn't that democratic, and that, you know, really, you know, the other parts of the world aren't really all that authoritarian either.
Yeah, I see a real crisis in bourgeois democratic countries, a crisis of governance. We've seen it in the UK, for example, where they had a conservative government for 14 years. And now, even with a Labor government, what is the fundamental difference? For example, on the question of Palestine, they seem to have very similar positions, if not the same position. On the situation going on in Africa, the
Well,
Labor Party seems to have the same position as the conservatives had. So now,
even on domestic issues, they're another austerity government.
yes, it doesn't look like they're going to make any real fundamental changes. I'm sure the labor movement there was hoping that there would be some breakthroughs in regard to better pay, better working conditions, a solution to the migrant crisis in the UK. Instead of a solution, we've seen riots, led by racist and neo-fascist elements in Britain, and this is under a Labor government. So these are the type of things that are going on, and in the United States, of course, is just as bad, if not worse. Here we have the potential of a civil war between the two different capitalist parties, capitalist imperialist parties in the United States. The real difference seems to be centered around personality, because both parties believe in U.S. hegemony and American exceptionalism. So the fundamental difference is which personality or which nuanced position should prevail. And if it does not prevail, then there's a real threat of more internecine conflict like we saw in 2021.
Well, I would
You
kind of
know, you mentioned migration, and that is a big issue for the U.S. here
Yes.
with Latin America mainly, and for Europe, a lot of it is Africa and the Middle East, and a lot of it has to do with, okay, you stir up problems, you create all kinds of problems for countries, often with sanctions, and then you complain when people flee those countries looking for, I'm not even going to say a better life, just a life.
Yes.
You know, and that becomes a major issue that then gets incorporated into their politics too.
Yes. And a lot of the people that are crossing, they don't necessarily come from South America or Central America or Mexico. You got a lot of people from Haiti, a lot of people from Africa that are crossing or attempting to cross the southern border. And it's so racist the way they depict the border crisis. If you look at the campaign commercials, it's about this dangerous San Francisco liberal who are allowing these illegal migrants to cross the border and commit crimes against U.S. citizens. They're overcrowding the hospitals in the southwest region of the United States. They're bringing in terrorists. All this type of propaganda
Yeah.
that we're being subjected to on a daily basis, that millions and millions of dollars are being spent to advance these ideas in the U.S. media.
I mean, yeah, I mean,
The ads do seem racist. I did want to see if we can get back to Africa.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
it's all
it's been
connected.
fun doing all this other
Yeah.
stuff. I wanted to ask what is going on in one of the other countries that has had disasters, and that is the Congo, right?
No, Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's still difficulties that are taking place, particularly in the eastern region, because it's rich in minerals and metals. And as a result of that, there's extreme competition between various multinational corporations. There are a number of rebel groups. One of the main ones, of course, is the M23 rebel group, which is said to be closely tied with the neighboring government of Rwanda. And that has not been settled as well. Now, you have the Southern African Development Community. They have a peacekeeping force there. The United Nations is pulling back, and because they have drawn a lot of opposition from the people in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. But yeah, the problem in the DRC has been in existence since they gained their independence in 1960. So we're talking about 64 years of destabilization there, wars that have been fought between various factions, many of whom are supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. We know that Patrice Lumumba was elected in 1960, and his government was overthrown within 3 or 4 months by the U.S. CIA, by the Belgian former colonial authorities. And Lumumba was assassinated at the aegis of Belgium and the United States. So all of this has been going on. The whole seeds of the destabilization has been taking place now for over 6 decades. So I think the awareness, despite the horrendous conditions that exist on a humanitarian basis, I think the awareness about the role of the U.S. is going to help in the long run to clarify a lot of these political issues, where people can work more towards unity as opposed to division, because the divisions are only helping the imperialist countries and the multinational corporations who are still making money in the country, despite the fact that people are suffering from hunger, displacement, and other social problems.
I mean, one thing I find very interesting is you listen to some of these leaders in popular leaders in Nigeria and some of these other places, and they'll talk about how content they are to have pluri-ethnic countries, right? They have different cultures, and they're a mix of these different cultures. And oddly, you hear the same thing, coming from Vladimir Putin about celebrating the diversity of all the different cultures that make up the Russian Federation. And then you go to some of these places where they have these like intense ethnic rivalries, right? And we call them tribal here because it's Africa, but they're no different from ethnic rivalries in any other place. And there are always things that are like could have been dealt with, but were stirred up by external forces, right? You always have the CIA down there kind of, looking for those ethnic levers that they can use to like turn people against one another to weaken a country. And you saw them doing the same thing in Ukraine, building up the neo-Nazi forces that were Russophobic and wanted to kill Russians, and you see it down in the Congo too, where a lot of this tension between this group and that group is really just stirred up by external forces.
Exactly, and what's at stake in the DRC is the mineral and strategic metals that they have inside the country that are indispensable to the world capitalist system. So we have to realize that there's much at stake as far as imperialism is concerned all over the African continent. That's why they want to keep the wars going in the Sahel region, why they want to keep these countries divided against each other, as well as divided internally. So we need to expose the fact that the root causes of all these disasters and underdevelopment has a lot to do with the world imperialist system. We haven't had a chance to talk about the impact of climate change, but this is another factor the fact that the U.S. and the Western countries dominate these annual UN climate conferences is a clear indication of why the problem persists. They want to veto every resolution, every agreement that does not profit the multinational corporations that are based in these Western imperialist countries. So we have to keep in mind, too, that the climate change issue is also rooted in the crisis, the modern day crisis of imperialism.
And it's interesting because you go to look at like a list of countries that are like using like 99 to 100% renewable sources, because there are countries like that, right? That
Yes.
you know, and it's like there's a couple that are like super solarized or super wind, but what you mainly see is like countries in Africa and other places that are using a lot of hydroelectric power. And then I guess Iceland uses a lot of geothermal, but I mean, you know, but you have all these countries that just run all their electric off a few dams, and that's where it all comes from.
I
And
believe there was a dam that just collapsed in Sudan.
Yes. Yeah, I read about that. Yeah, and that
That's
probably has a lot to do with the lack of maintenance and people observing the environment and the infrastructure due to the displacement and the internal conflict within the military itself.
yeah, it's hard to keep a country running and do those types of projects when most of your resources are going to blowing up your infrastructure.
Yeah, same thing
Instead of
in
building
Libya.
it. Yeah.
It's a huge disaster a couple of years ago, and of course that was linked to the overthrow of the Gaddafi government back in 2011, and the country has still not been able to become stable, to set up a unified government, and also to deal with the vast energy resources they have, whereas the people are becoming poor and poorer every year.
We
And
are coming to the end of the hour. If someone wants to find out more, where do they go to find more? How do
Well, they
how
can
do they find you?
they can log on to the Pan-African Newswire blog. That's at panafricannews.blogspot.com. That's panafricannews.blogspot.com. They can also find me on X. They can find me on Facebook, Instagram. I contribute articles to several publications, fighting-words.net.
Black
That's
Agenda
fighting
Report.
words.
I'm sorry, Black
Black
Agenda.
Agenda Report,
Yeah.
yes, is another one. So, yeah, you can just Google me and you can read my articles on a regular basis.
Okay. All right. Well, it's always great to have you, even if our discussions tend to spiral out of control. I
Yes.
really enjoyed talking with you just the same.
That's been great.
Yeah, yeah, no. So, we're if I hadn't screwed up and put the shorter version of the music on, then we'd be playing the outgoing music right now. So,
Okay.
so we're not going to get that this time. But thank you again very
All right.
much,
Thank you.
Abayomi Azikiwe.
All right. Thank you.
All right, bye bye.
Bye.